Thanks, John, and thanks for that lovely introduction. One thing you didn't mention is that Cree and I have been married for 25 years, and thank you. And hi, Cree.
Hi, Dwight. How's it going upstairs?
Yeah, remember how writers used to divide their time on their back flaps between like Rome and Gstaad?
Yeah.
Now we divide our time between the living room and then the refrigerator, right? I mean,
yeah. So
you're actually downstairs and I'm upstairs. Welcome to your first socially distanced book event.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here. I am really grateful to McNally Jackson and to everyone who has shown up with their computer in their lap with a cocktail or any kind of beverage to witness this. So yes.
So is it strange to publish a novel during COVID?
I don't know if strange is the word I would use, Dwight. I would use like, oh my God, mind-blowing, bizarre, incredibly unexpected. I really wish we were all sitting together somewhere having this conversation in person, of course. But again, like, I'm very happy to, I don't know, just take, I guess, like all of us right now, I will take what I can get at this incredibly unexpected moment. So it's all new. Yes, I wish my novel were not coming out during a pandemic, definitely.
I imagine the best of times publishing a novel is like writing a poem and folding it up and throwing it down the Grand Canyon. I mean, I asked this already, but it must sort of be hard just to not, I mean, I know you like doing book events, I know you like reading. Do you think people's appetite for fiction is as big as it was during COVID? Or are we really distracted? How do you feel personally?
You know, we were just talking with John, the host at McNally Jackson, about this before, and I have talked to a bunch of people who've said this as well, which is that the first 3 months of the pandemic, reading was the hardest thing. I tried to read so many different books and I couldn't read. Like I just couldn't, all I did was look at the news and I don't know, stew in my own horrible juices. And finally, my ability to read came back. And I'm so grateful that it came back. And I think that's true for a bunch of people, maybe on very different timelines, but I think we're reading now more than we ever have. And I think, I'm hoping that, I mean, for me anyway, I read to escape. I reread a ton. I actually have an essay about rereading coming out on LitHub, I think tomorrow. But I also read things that are not about the pandemic. You reviewed a book, I forget what it was, about the pandemic kind of midway through.
And I thought, oh my God. Thriller, yeah.
What was it called?
Robert Wright's Thriller. I'm blanking on the name now, but it's terrific.
Yeah, so in other words, I don't want to read anything about disease or apocalypse or dark times. I want to read my usual 19th century fiction, and I want to reread everything I know I love. So that's a long way to answer your question about reading.
A lot of people watching won't know that you and I are living in West Virginia for the year. Well, I'm working on a memoir, and you moved with me. We're almost done with the year now, but I'm thinking about your books. It's a very New York City book. It's very Manhattan. It's very urban. And I'm wondering how much you thought of Manhattan as a character in the novel.
Well, I definitely do. And, you know, I wrote it while I was living in New York, and I wrote it while I was traveling to the places where the novel takes place. So the couple in the novel go to the Cape, and they go to the Hamptons, and they go to Vermont, and they go to the Berkshires. So it's kind of, to me, a quintessentially New York experience of a sort of privileged existence that many people in New York live, which is sort of getting out of the city periodically or on weekends or on long weekends as much as possible. And, you know, for a lot of people who actually have a summer house, that means maybe just decamping. But obviously the couple in the novel were just lucky enough to be able to kind of just get out of the city and get invited out of the city. So I guess I'm feeling, living in West Virginia, I feel really removed from the city. I feel really sad for what the city went through earlier in the pandemic. I feel sad for what it's going through still. And I feel sorry that I'm not there to sort of be with it in a funny way, but I'm not, so.
Right, you talk about all the sort of grand places these two characters go in the summer, but part of what makes this a dark comedy of manners, your novel, is that their lives are falling apart, and it's very, I mean, it's a comedy of manners, but it's dark too. I mean, it's not sort of a celebration of the good life, you know.
Right. So, I mean, I do think it's a classic sort of novel of manners in the sense that it's talking about class and it's talking about and making a bit of fun of class distinctions and money distinctions and the things that we in our minute little lives care about. I mean, I think of Austen as the classic sort of novel of manners novelist, because she very subtly poked fun at all our pretensions and all our ridiculousness about property and money and manners and clothing and all these different distinctions that that you know, as human beings, I think matter to us, however trivial they are. At this particular moment, I feel like those kind of, that minutia can feel even more trivial to some people, but it's also essential. It's human. So,
you know, there's a lot of dark things to talk about in this book, but let's start on the light end, because on a certain level, the novel is about a search for a lost dog, and you know, it's kind of that kind of propels it in a way. And I'm wondering. Talk to me about what that dog stands for in this novel. Like, you seem to use it in a lot of different ways.
So yeah, or I could just let the dog speak for herself. She's right here.
Oh God, here we go. Oh,
there's Maebelle. So of course she's on my lap. I included the dog in the book because she seemed to me to be a sort of, she epitomizes in some ways what I think people do with their pets, which is get deeply, deeply attached to them in ways that can seem almost pathological. And the characters in the novel have conflict over this attachment to some degree. So, and I'm very attached to this dog. So I was definitely drawing on a fair amount of my own experience. Of course, I actually named the dog the same name that my dog is named, so which just drives it right home. But I actually was walking our dog in our neighborhood where we used to live on 137th, and they, you know, like everyone else in New York, I would see these lost dog posters, and my mind went to the thought, oh my God, what if that were my dog? And so I sort of played with that in the midst of working on this book, and I was curious to explore what that might feel like for my character to lose her dog, because it seemed so devastating.
Do you like reading about animals in fiction? I mean, there are a lot of examples. Most famously, recently, was Sigrid Nunez's novel, The Friend, which I really admired. Do you sort of like it when a pet pops up in fiction?
You know, I don't find pets that memorable in fiction, weirdly, but I do find them memorable in the fiction I read as a young girl. So, you know, I'm an adherent of like Black Beauty and My Friend Flicka. Those are both horse books. Brighty of the Grand Canyon. You know, and there's plenty of dog books that we all read, not just Lassie, but what are some of the great dog books that kids read? Anyway, so I feel like pets and animals are a huge part of my sort of imagination and my emotional life. But I don't know how many books that I am deeply attached to now, for example, are contemporary books where pets really matter that much.
Mm-hmm. You know, the philosopher Stanley Cavell has this phrase, I think it's called the Comedy of Remarriage. And it's about couples who have been in marriage for a long time and trying to put that marriage back together, like remarriage, trying to make it happen again. Do you think your novel fits that category?
The Comedy of Remarriage. I think it might, but I don't want to give too much away. So in other words, I think this book is about a marriage that is at its nadir. It's just a mess. They're not communicating. They're not, they kind of loathe each other. They're kind of bored with each other. But I think this is a state that a lot of long-term relationships go through at various points. And I think some people probably blow apart at that point. But other people figure out ways to either get through it or tolerate it or hopefully talk about it. But I was curious about those dark points and what happens when my characters, what they do with that stuckness, because when you're in a marriage and you have a lot of, you have property, you have children, you have pets, you have a life, it's very sticky. And that stickiness keeps you in it in a way that you would just blow it right apart if it were, all those things weren't in place. So I think it's that stuckness that I was interested in. And I wanted to think about whether, why do we stay in bad marriages? Or are bad marriages just temporarily bad marriages? Do they, effortlessly become something else just as quickly as they became bad? So I was curious about that question. So in some ways, yes. But having said that, I'm not sure it doesn't have a happy ending. So I'm not sure the quotation requires that.
Right. It's funny, Lori Moore said something like a writer sort of chooses things from a pantry of maybe their own lives and experiences, but the dish doesn't resemble the pantry. And I mention that because I've now read your novel several times, very happily. And I probably recognize, my life and your life and our lives, maybe 7%, I can see the threads. Thank you, by the way, for making my character have lots of hair and be tall.
Yeah, no problem. You're very handsome. In fiction and in person.
I don't know. So, but I know that this kind of novel, and also one of the main characters is a shrink. And I know that that's a topic, you've addressed psychiatry before in your memoir, Lights On, Rats Out. Why are you attracted to psychiatrists in your writing, do you think?
I find the process so damn fascinating. I just can't help myself. So I had just a devilish good time getting inside this shrink's head, who is the male character, the husband. Peter is his name, Peter Nutting, Dr. Peter Nutting. And, he's not a perfect shrink. And I got to mix up a lot of my fears about what psychiatrists think of their patients, and a lot of my sort of anxiety about, what they secretly imagine, and also my sort of fantasies about what they might imagine that got kind of dragged over in opposite perspective from my memoir. So I just had a really good time with it. I love writing about it, and I'm waiting for some psychiatrist to tell me that no dialogue would go that way, or that he's such a terrible shrink. But actually, it's pretty close to I've done a lot of therapy, so I certainly have plenty of dialogue to draw from. And I don't think I think I'm pretty close. I'll probably be corrected just for saying that. But anyway, so I can't help myself. It's like catnip to me.
So your memoir had kind of a dark take. A complicated take. This slightly, I don't even use the word light, but how would you differentiate the takes on psychiatry in the two books, your two major books?
Well, I really flipped the tables in this book. So in other words, my memoir was about desiring my psychiatrist. Like in Lights On, Rats Out, I was in love with my psychiatrist. And that was a very real experience for me. And it was entirely unrequited, and everything was proper. But as the years went on, so that was in my 20s that happened. So now I'm a little older, and I have a little more perspective on what actually went on in my treatment. And I think that's one of the things is that he might have made a few mistakes. So some people who read the book think he made a ton of mistakes, and other people think he was, a really talented, compassionate, like trying his best psychiatrist. But so I got to play with the idea that maybe that he had desire coming from his end in the room. So I got to sort of imagine that experience of being the psychiatrist desiring a patient because he has a very naughty crush on one of his patients that plays out throughout the novel, throughout Private Means, which was just a lot of fun for me to imagine. It was almost like taking the power of what I had experienced as sort of a subject and just flipping it around and yet owning it in a certain sense. So, yeah.
So, Cree, was this an easy book to write?
You know, this book was so easy to write that
Right.
I
Hear that. Anyone who's a writer watching this now.
I know that's really it's kind of an asshole thing to say, but I really had fun writing this book. I would write it. I brought my laptop with me everywhere I went that summer, and I remember I would sit up and, you know, someone would just make me a nice coffee, and I would sit upstairs and write for 3 hours in the every morning. I just would work on it, and it wasn't a chore. It was fun. And then when I sort of ran out of things to say, I stopped. I mean, one of the great things about this book, and I think about fiction, and this is my first novel, so I'm absolutely in love with this when this happens, is that the characters actually kind of do take over. They propel the book along in their own way. And I don't mean that in a magical, thinky kind of way. I just mean that whatever's going on in my imagination is working on some level that I can't really control, or I don't really want to control, so I let it sort of have its own life. So in other words, it's as if the characters are writing the book for you, and that's how I felt with this book.
Wow. And so most writers say they need to have an exact time every day to write from 8 to 11 or something. You didn't need that at all.
No, I wrote in the morning though, because I think I'm sharpest in the morning, and then I would feel sort of good about myself during the day because I'd written for 3 hours, which is not a great, a hugely high bar, but it felt like the way I needed to get this book done. It felt natural to me.
Cyril Connolly said that it's hard to write with, I think he said, a pram in the hallway. Was it hard to write with a professional working book critic down the hall every morning?
A pram in the hallway. Interesting. Yeah, it's not easy writing. It's not easy being married to a professional book critic or someone who reads as voraciously as you do everything that new that comes out. And I know it's also not easy to be a writer in a family where everyone's opinion is so huge. Like, you know, anyone who's read you knows how massive and heartfelt your opinions are. So yeah, it can be daunting, and I think I think I've managed to not let it get in my way since I wrote my memoir, but it took me writing that, I think, to sort of get you out of the way. So I pushed the pram down the stairs, down it goes.
So let's talk about reading for a second. Can you read novels while you're working on your own, or do you have to sort of go cold turkey?
No, I love reading, but I wouldn't want to read anything similar to what I'm trying to write. So, you know, I wouldn't read Fleischman is in Trouble when I was trying to write this novel, because that book's a really funny book about a marriage and a marriage in trouble. So I would stay as far as possible from my own topic, I think. I mean, I like to read I like to read Henry James and, you know, Dickens, and I like to read old stuff more than Graham Greene, and I don't know. I just like old stuff better than I like new stuff, so it's easier. So I think reading old stuff was always pretty safe for me.
Did you feel like you modeled this book on anything? You know what I mean? Do you feel like you had influences, literary influences?
You know, I mean, I feel like an ass even saying it, but I really love the way Ian McEwan manages to have one little event push things off into other directions. So if anything, I was thinking of that with the dog incident. The dog isn't meant to be sort of even so much a motif or a sentimental object. It's a little bit of a way of having insight into Alice's emotional life, but more than anything, I think I meant it as an event that could like just sort of push things off kilter, which I think he does so masterfully in all his books. I'm a huge fan. So.
Yep. You know, before you wrote your memoir, before you wrote your novel, you wrote a fair number of cookbooks. You ghost wrote a few, co-wrote a few, and wrote 4 of your own. And the last one, which was called Fish in 2013, was a finalist for the James Beard Award. And there's a fair amount of food too in the novel. And I'm wondering, I know, can you talk a bit about, I mean, I know that you felt as a cookbook writer that you wanted to move beyond that at some point. I know that you wanted to sort of, you had more things to say to be contained in a cookbook. And can you talk about that and a bit about how food functions? You have a very, I mean, I know you well, and I know that your feelings about food, like you grew up in a food family, your father was a well-known chef on the West Coast. But you have very simple taste. You're not a really gonzo foodie type at all. You're like very simple, very good food, and but very earnest, simple food. And anyway, what can you say about food in your work, and what were you thinking about it now and in this novel?
Okay, first I'm going to get a complex if you call my food simple one more time. But other than that,
Maybe I should cook tonight, Cree.
Yeah, I know. I did have a complex about my food writing. I felt like I was at the kids' table at Thanksgiving. So I'm surrounded by you, and I have a lot of friends who write what I consider grown-up books. And they're novelists, and they write nonfiction, or they write history, or they write academic books. And I just felt like I was sitting there writing, one paragraph head notes for my chicken recipe. And then I just really wasn't taking that seriously. I realized I do think writing cookbooks is a very different skill than writing nonfiction or fiction or poetry or criticism. But I really, really wanted to write what I considered a grown-up book. So I ripped the Band-Aid off really hard with my memoir and wrote the most sort of gory, hardcore book I could possibly come up with to tell that story, which I'd sort of tucked away. And then writing this book, I actually, and I'm straying from your food question, but I'm going to keep going. Writing this book, I really wanted to write a book that was more fun to read, because people would say, well, I read your memoir, and yeah, that was quite an experience, and I'd be like, sorry. So I really wanted to write a book that was fun. I wanted people to take this damn book to the beach and get it wet and dirty with sand and pass it around to their friend and say, this is kind of a fun read. So as for food in the book, though, I do think there's a fair amount of food in the book. And I was actually surprised because I read the final copy finally, the final. I mean, when you write a novel, you read it 8 million times, as anyone knows. And it had been just long enough that I was struck by how much wine they drink and how much talk of food there is. So it crept in there, and I think it's just always it's part of how we differentiate ourselves from others, particularly these days in this sort of food is all about class and knowledge and certain kinds of power, and I don't know, I think it's relevant. And I don't love the food culture right now, and as you know, I don't watch food TV, and I find it all a little bit suffocating, but I also find it I find it central. Otherwise it wouldn't be in there so much.
Well, let's go back to talk about the travel a little bit in this book. The characters are moving around. Do you think that Alice, your protagonist, is seeking what a psychiatrist would call a geographical cure?
Well, I don't know why you're blaming it on her, because they travel as a couple. So, whether or not they are seeking a geographical cure, I would say they are. And I would say almost anyone I think the pandemic it's been a real lesson, I think, in a hard one for people who are lucky enough to get to move around the world a fair amount, because all of a sudden you can't pull a geographical. You can't just get bored with your own little life and get on a plane and go somewhere, or even drive to see friends in another state. It's really hard. And I think it's forced us all to really just look at our own navels much longer and harder than we'd like to, and at the texture of our own existence without interruption. So yes, I think they do that, but I can't resist doing that, and I will go back to doing that the minute I'm able to.
Well, you're making it sound awfully fancy. I mean, we pretty much drive 35 miles. That's our idea of a vacation.
I know that. Yes. We're not so fancy, but we do have some fancy friends occasionally. So that little shred of truth in there.
So talk to me a bit more about the process of writing this. Are you a big rewriter? Like, did you go through a lot of, or did it come out just the way you wanted it, or did you end up tinkering with it a lot more?
No, I tinker and tinker and tinker. And then I have these really wonderful people at Grove who help me edit it. Elizabeth Schmitz is a wonderful editor, and I adore working with her. So she also has made both of my books better by just being a really smart reader. So process-wise, I would say that there are people who know exactly how their book ends, for example, and can't keep writing until what's above that day's sentence is perfect. I am not one of those people. I revise and rewrite all my chapters continuously throughout the whole process of writing the book. And then I go back and do it some more once my editor has read it. And then I go back and do it some more once someone I respect has read it. So it's a big, long process.
Talk to me about the title. Why Private Means?
Well, I think novels of manners are about private lives very much. In other words, about privacy, about what goes on behind closed doors within households. So the word private was important to me, but I love the term private means because it has this sort of moneyed, like, oh, well, she has private means, which means someone has a trust fund. So I was sort of trying to skewer that whole.
But I think you also, it's funny reading it, I felt like you meant it was some kind of like inner fortitude. The sense, I read it, is that way in a good deal. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, there's also, I like the title because, for example, it also, they have their own private means sexually. The couple, are self-gratifying. In other words, masturbation is, directly referenced. So there you have that. And then there's the money angle. And then there's, nicely put, the fortitude or the private means of sort of pushing through. I think privacy also in a marriage is a pretty fascinating, or in a couple is a fascinating thing to look at, because privacy is something that you give up so much of when you're living with someone. And I am at various times very ambivalent about not living with you anymore, but just living with people, because I'm a kind of a loner and you are too. So we get along. But I think privacy is really a big deal for a lot of people.
Could you have written this book? Our kids are both in college now. They left 2 or 3 years ago. Could you have written this book when they were still at home? I just mean in terms of
time.
Psychic, it's just harder to write.
Probably not. And this book did arise out of, there are parts of it that are modeled on the darkest moments in our marriage, which were right around the time that they were leaving home. And I do think that transitional empty nest moment for a lot of couples, it's just huge. All of a sudden you've spent 18 years focusing on nothing but your children, and suddenly they're not in your house anymore, and you have to reconfigure the whole thing. You have to rethink the whole thing. And then now we have a pandemic and everyone's back again. So it's like a complete mindfuck. So yeah.
Now, have you found it, I'm sorry to move on for a second beyond your novel, but can you talk a bit, do you feel comfortable talking about your next project, or you don't want to sort of leave that aside?
Well, I'm glad you're asking me this while you're, way in the other room where I hate you. Yeah, my next, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but I was slogging away on a novel when the pandemic happened. And the thing wasn't going very well anyway, but once the pandemic hit, it really just, I don't know. I couldn't read, but I definitely couldn't write. And everything feels like it's shifted. So I'm going to give that book a little space still and go back to it. So I have not been very productive as a writer. And it's one of the things I really admire about you, Dwight, because in fact, you are on deadline every week, and you have to do your job to keep.
Yeah, but it's a deadline.
Really said.
Yeah.
And it's a big deal. You also actually have a book coming out.
I do. We'll have time to talk about this some other time. But I have a book. I have a very strange book. A friend of mine. It's a book of quotations, and a friend of mine described it as a book of quotations on tequila, which is an odd way to describe it. But I have a critique of books of quotations that I find them rather dull. They lean on the same old canned stuff. A penny saved is a penny earned, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been collecting quotations and favorite passages for longer than I want to admit now in a commonplace book. And I've organized my favorite quotations. And the thing about these quotations are they're not so upbeat. I mean, they're all sort of about, dark things in life. And a typical quotation is Patti Smith saying that a guy's not really your boyfriend until he's vomited on you, kind of thing, And it's just all the darkest things, my favorite things, funny things, strange things, from all the books I've read. And, it's a weird book. I don't think there's been anything quite like it, but we'll see how it goes. It's strange.
No, I'm really excited for you. And I think you've managed to not only keep writing your criticism throughout this ridiculous, horrible period, but also have pulled together that book and are just you've been very productive. So you asked me about productivity and I feel like you're sort of like the productivity model. We should stamp you out somehow.
Well, let's keep this on you for a second. Let's talk about the fact that you hate reading books after I've read them, because I get a lot of books, as you know.
Oh boy.
Although let me say before, I mean, COVID is really, if you're a book critic, it's really, it's been true for everyone, but I used to be sent all the books that came out, and now thanks to COVID, very few books are being sent out to critics, and we get PDF files instead. And I don't like reading on a screen. I can't take notes. I'm a big note taker. And anyway, maybe you can take over from there, Cree.
Yeah, it's really a ruinous situation. It's very bad. Dwight ruins books every time he reads them by underlining every, huge chunks of text on every page. So I can't read with that kind of interference on my page going on. And I'm not a priss about books. Like, I'll mark up my books, but I make nice little tick marks. And I mean, I fold down the pages and I get them wet in the pool and I mess with them in all kinds of ways. But a book that Dwight has read, that you've read, is impossible for anyone else to read again. They actually have to go in the trash, which is just
whatever I hear
you keep them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a little rough. So we generally read fairly different things. Some overlap, but yeah.
So John Updike used to say that when his new books would arrive, he would open the package and pick it up and start reading it again to see what it was like, until he saw like the first bad sentence or maybe the first typo. I'm not suggesting there are any typos in your book. I'm just wondering, can you pick it up now, or just want to leave it be for a while?
Well, I had wanted to leave it be, but I felt like I had to revisit it. And I have to say, I'm really happy with it. I read it again and I see things differently. I think I see it afresh. I remember how much I emphasized this or that, or I think, ooh, I was a little rough on that. And it is a strange experience to read your work when, by the time it's actually printed and published, because it's been such a long time since you wrote the original draft. So I think that's kind of what he's getting at. I don't know about, don't you think? I mean, I'm sure, I don't know. So ask me I have the feeling I won't be rereading my own book immediately after now. I'd like to, but it's always a fun experience to leave it and then come back to it, because then you can sort of see it afresh.
I know that you're a big fan. I mean, Cree reads, and I read professionally. I read a lot, but Cree reads even more than I do. And I know that you've really been into audiobooks. I mean, for a long time now. When you're not reading a book, you're walking around listening to a book.
Yeah.
And I know you read your own version of the memoir. I've forgotten now. What's happening with this book in terms of audiobook?
So I asked the woman who actually produced my memoir is also a narrator herself. Her name is Jamie Matler, and she actually did the narration for this. So I think I listened to some of it today, and she's done, I mean, I couldn't even access it till today. She's done a terrific job, I think. She's a pro, and I knew from the experience of reading my memoir how hard that job is. And I have very favorite narrators. And I knew that for this novel, I really wanted a professional to do it, because it makes a big difference. And I'm so picky about my narrators when I listen to books that.
So I know you worship a couple of narrators. Can you tell our listeners one or two they should look for? Because I know you look for the reader.
Well, Juliet Stevenson is the queen of all queens. Like, she's just amazing. And she's got all of Austen, and she reads Middlemarch, and she reads, I mean, you got to have her for most of those classics. Anything, I mean, she's done some Stranger Thing books too. Liz Gilbert got her to do Signature All Things. So she reads that. But she's got the perfect voice. It's, it's just, I just want her to read to me anytime, anywhere. And then Return of the Native is read by, who's my favorite narrator there? Now I can't remember, sorry. Yeah, I have very favorites, and I listen to them over again. So I not only do I reread, I re-listen a lot. Yeah.
And, well, let me ask a different question. There are two kids in this novel, and they're not anything like our kids, and they're two girls. We have a boy and a girl. How do you feel about kids reading your memoir, reading this novel, both of which are a little tough?
I'm surprised you. Well, I mean, you're right. They're a little tough. I mean, the memoir is really tough, and the kids our kids did not read it, and were relieved that I did not want them to read it. They can read it when I'm dead, as far as I'm concerned, or not at all. Either way. It's just rough. It's like seeing your mom in a nude scene in a really dirty movie or something. Like, you just don't want that. So this book, though, it does have some, like, a little naughty scenes, a little sex, a little this and that, and it isn't always pretty, but it's fiction. So I feel good about the kids reading it. And actually, Hattie, our daughter, helped copy edit, and she has been an amazing reader for this book, and made some great suggestions. Has a terrific eye, saved me from many embarrassments. So I'm really, I've loved having Hattie as a reader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are you reading and listening to now?
What am I listening to now? I have been on a Graham Swift binge. So Waterland and what's the other one? The Sweet Shop Owner, and they're all, and I had never read much of him, so I've listened to a ton of him lately, which I just love. And then I ordered the books because I need to have them and then some books, of course, don't lend themselves all that well to listening. Even if they're wonderful to listen to, you want to actually have the book. So.
Okay. I see John back on our screen. Hi, John.
Ciao. I do have a couple questions from the chat.
Okay, good.
Great.
One is about, you mentioned an ideal reader, but when you're actually writing, do you have a kind of reader in mind? I remember from my own experience in creative writing workshops, they always tell you to imagine who it is that will be reading your book. Do you do that, or do you just write?
It's funny. I've tried that because it is really standard advice. It's sort of like, and my friend Liz, who's written a ton of books and is a terrific writer and always writes it for someone different. Like, she'll write one book for somebody and one book for another friend and one for her mom or something. And it doesn't really work for me. I sort of write to my own interior nasty critic, like not the really mean part of myself, but just the part that's like, so I think I don't really have an ideal reader so much as a sort of sniff test to pass that's my own.
Yeah. And I have a question about the title, and whether there were any alternative titles or whether it was always Private Means.
You know, I will say, okay, so one of the things, I don't know much about my books very often before I start writing them. I know that sounds crazy, but I almost always have the title. So I'll have a title and no book to go with it. I had Private Means as a title before I started writing it. And it was always going to be that. My first book, which was going to be called, and actually the title got changed, was going to be Chasing Skirt, which was a book about skirt steak.
Well, you're talking about a cookbook here.
Yes, that was a cookbook. But it got changed, sadly. But that was a great steak book title. Anyway, so to answer that question, yes.
You mentioned reading mostly older books, and you also mentioned the ease with which you wrote Private Means. I'm sort of curious if there were any problems in the writing of Private Means that you found a solution for in your reading. Was there anything that really character or a scene that gave you difficulty that you then were able to figure out from your reading? Or was it a completely
effortless, just ripped it right off? I'm trying to think about that.
Like, did you ever read anything and think, that's the key?
I think a ton. So one of the things my friend Johnny Miles once said, your friends will always read your books and try to find themselves in them. And they usually pick the wrong person and they get really pissed off. And I'm probably misquoting Johnny, so sorry about that. But anyway, I think he's right. But the other thing is that I want to say about that is I think that my characters they're not based on anyone. They're huge amalgamations of characters. And I think a lot of them are probably based more on fictional characters than they are on actual characters. So they're just big mixes of all the reading I've done and all the characters I've loved in fiction. In some ways, like I said, it almost sounds pretentious. I don't mean it to sound that way. I just like, if there's no real, they're not based on anything real. So I think they're based on that. So maybe character is what I was helped by.
Is that Dear American Airlines, Johnny?
That is Dear American Airlines, Johnny, and Want Not, Johnny. Yes.
Such
a great book, right? Such a great writer.
Was there anything about the writing of the book that made you feel nervous? Whether it was nervous about it being read, maybe by your kids or by anybody else? Was there any element of fear in the composition of what it means?
Very definitely. So one of the things about writing this book was having my husband read it for the first time, because it is about a bad marriage, and it's not about our bad marriage. And these are fictional characters and they are very much not us, but there are elements in this book from our very real marriage. And I wasn't sure how well he would take to that. So I was pretty nervous when he read it, very nervous. And he was incredibly generous and incredibly complimentary. So that was the big one. Yeah.
I have a question from John in the chat about something in the book. I hope. Why are the coffee cups different? Is that ringing a bell?
Well, I've been drinking from 2 different coffee mugs.
It's your coffee cup?
Nice.
Nice detective work, John. No, I've got a frog in my throat. So I had a mug of tea and I had iced tea and hot tea to see which would work. And and they both have. So yeah, good eye though. I've got my Washington Post mug, one of the first places I ever wrote for, and my late great Village Voice mug. So
beautiful.
There we are.
This is what you should be drinking. This is a Mrs. Dalloway, which is a cocktail from my book that I made for myself today.
What's in the Mrs. Dalloway?
It's muddled cucumber, mint, gin, club soda. And in my case, I had to put a lemon, no lime, because I didn't have a lime. But it's delicious.
I'm gonna have 2 in a minute.
Another question from the chat. Cree, you talked about rereading. Which titles have you returned to now? Which titles do you have in West Virginia that you can return to now?
We brought almost all our books here because we've been here for a year. I put probably 10, I don't know, 5 boxes of books, 10 boxes in storage, but most of our books are here. I return to, I return to the classics a lot. But I also return to and that means like Middlemarch. That's the only Eliot I really care about. But I return to all of the Austen. I return to David Copperfield, not the rest of the Dickens particularly. I return to, I love Robert Stone. I love the book Circe, Madeline Miller. And Achilles is great too. She also wrote that. What else do I return to? I just wrote this whole list. I think Henry James is probably the most returnable to author that I reread, because you always get more. And there's always something new. How many times you can read The Golden Bowl like 5 times if you can do that, and you're gonna come away every time with different levels of sort of interest. It's so nuanced and so dense. So I'm always happy rereading. So.
A question that's maybe looking for some advice. Do you ever feel inhibited when you write? And if so, how do you work through that so that you can work freely? Is it just a matter of getting yourself to care less at the same time that you're caring more?
I think you have to not give a fuck.
Hey, we're not on radio. You can swear.
Okay, good. So I really think you just can't. You got to get over any kind of embarrassment, because when I wrote my memoir, if there was anything embarrassing, there was so much humiliating stuff in that book that I can't believe that I wrote down. But you know what? I survived it. And now it's like much less humiliating because it's on paper between 2 covers. Like, it's just done. It's like off me. Yeah. So, and this is fiction. And it's embarrassing to have thoughts that are kind of gross or mean or awful, but human beings are really complicated, and I don't have to attribute them to me. I get to attribute them to my characters. So good luck parsing what's me and what's not. That's impossible.
I think we have time for just one last question, which is there anything that in the writing of the book really surprised you? You had a story that you set out and wanted to tell, but when you talked about the characters sort of taking on a life of their own, was there anything that happened in the book that really caught you off guard, even as the person that was making that thing happen?
I was really surprised by how both of my characters did these really shitty things, which you'll find out about if you read the book. And yet at the end, and they weren't nice to each other, and they were just awful in a lot of ways to each other. I was surprised by how much they actually really loved each other at the end. Even though they still had all this loathing. So I was pleased that at the stickiness of their relationship, I guess. Yeah. So on that.
Well, Cree, Dwight, thank you so much for letting us host you this way. We'll bring you back for the paperback party at Prince Street. The link one last time to order it from McNallyJackson.com is in the chat. But just thanks again to the 2 of you and everybody who joined us. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks. And thanks to everyone for coming. It was terrific to have everyone here spending their time, their evening. And I really hope we can all just be in the same room for the paperback. That would be such a gift.
It'll happen. It'll happen here at City Point. I can come. You can see my store.
Thank you so much, everyone. Okay. Thank you, John.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.